Welcome to the WWH show. This is a show that asks a series of why, what, and how questions on topics that have national, regional, and global significance and implications. Today we have such a topic to talk about. Why has promotion for democracy and freedom in Africa or Ethiopia bore fruit yet? In this studio, I have the privilege to talk to and discuss this topic with Dave Peterson. He is a Senior Director of Africa Program at National Endowment for Democracy. Dave, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Assegid.
I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk about why promotion for democracy and freedom in Africa and Ethiopia hasn't bore yet some fruits. The first question is why your organization, National Endowment for Democracy, exists, which means what is the mission of your organization?
Well, the National Endowment for Democracy was established more than 30 years ago by an act of Congress as a independent grant-making organization. We were set up because a lot of people in those days were looking around at the state of affairs in the world, and there were concerns. This was towards the end of the Cold War, that there were democracy movements that were making progress, but were not getting the sort of support that they should get, and that the United States government itself was not really in a position to support. But we saw in some other countries, Germany in particular, where there were some political foundations, foundations such as Friedrich Ebert or Konrad Adenauer, that were able to support political progress in Europe at the time. And so they said, well, you know, the United States should have something similar. And so we were established. There are some other organizations that are associated with us: the National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, Solidarity Center that works with trade unions, Center of National Private Enterprise that works with business. So are these independent
organizations?
They're also independent, but they receive funding from us.
Okay.
We're a grant-making organization, and so we provide them with a lot of the resources that they use to go around the world, observing elections, training legislatures, working with trade unions, trying to develop them, promoting economic reform, working with business associations, that kind of thing. We also have a fund that provides assistance directly to civil society organizations around the world, human rights groups, independent press, women and youth, conflict resolution programs. There's quite a broad array of activities that we support.
After 30 years, do you think that you have achieved your goals?
Well, I'd say democracy is a work in progress. We still have a long ways to go. For better or worse, I don't see us going out of existence for lack of work. But I think we have made some progress, particularly in the case of Africa. When I first started at the endowment, many years ago, 1988 to be exact, if you looked around the continent, there were only a handful of countries that one could really describe as democracies. There was Botswana, Gambia, Senegal, maybe Mauritius, all small countries really. But for the most part, the continent was just dictatorships, one-party states. There was no free press hardly anywhere. There were no opposition political parties. It was really a very, very closed continent. Then, of course, there was a breakthrough in the early 90s. Sometimes the progress can seem very slow and frustrating. But I think, even this year, the elections in Nigeria were a huge advance for democracy in Africa. And I think in some other places, we're continuing to see slow but really significant progress.
You mentioned about progress is frustrating. That means it's not going the way you wanted. So what do you think are some of the goals that you couldn't be able to achieve in Africa in terms of promoting freedom and democracy in Africa? Some of the goals that you couldn't be able to achieve.
Yeah, well, I think the goals would be for there to be opposition political parties able to campaign freely in elections, that the press be completely free to report and write, that civil society organizations be free to organize. I think there's a big problem in many countries that even might have some democratic institutions with corruption. That's a big problem. Democratic governments are not always able to really deliver on the sort of economic front as well. People get very frustrated in Africa with that. But I think that recently we've seen a lot of these sort of civic movements coming up in places like Senegal, for example, or Burkina Faso. There was quite a remarkable uprising, popular uprising. We're seeing this in many places in Africa these days. Some places it's still, nascent, just beginning, but in other places it's really beginning to gain some momentum.
I think one of the challenges, you may correct me, that may prevent you or hinder your progress is the backing you need from, for example, international community organizations, donor organizations. Even if they fund organizations like yours, they're not out there publicly pressurizing dictatorial regimes. So I think that's a hindrance, because if, as much as they give funds and finance, they should also back it by diplomatic pressures and other means of pressuring these dictatorial regimes, so that they may open up and make freedom and democracy possible.
Well, of course that's true. I think there could always be a lot more support for democracy, both in terms of the financial resources, but also the diplomacy is very important. It's not easy. And of course, governments have
their own
different interests sometimes. Our foundation and many democracy organizations or human rights organizations are very focused on that as a mission. Governments have other priorities, strategic, economic, what have you. And so, I think we respect that. But still, the United States claims to be committed to democracy around the world. It's one of our priorities. And, part of the purpose of the endowment is to really try to elevate that. I think ultimately, however, it's the populations in the countries that are concerned that bear the greatest responsibility. I mean, we in the international community can provide support, solidarity and financial resources, but if the people in the country are not willing to or not interested in taking a stand and fighting for democracy, we can't impose democracy. It's I was saying with the promotion, we don't really think of ourselves as promoting democracy. We're not exporting democracy from the United States to Africa.
Other countries, okay.
We're supporting it where Africans are standing up and saying we want democracy. Then we feel that it's really our obligation, as Americans to support what they're calling for.
So what do you think is the main reason why Africa is not free and there is no democracy in Africa? The main reason, one or two reasons.
Yeah, well, as I was saying before, I think there is democracy in Africa. There's been a lot of progress, but obviously in a number of countries, they are still suffering from dictatorship. There's a lot of work still needs to be done, even in countries that are a little bit democratic. Freedom House has these different sort of rankings, 1 through 7. There's countries that they consider to be completely free. There's others that are partly free, and then there's a whole group at the bottom that are not free.
Countries like Ethiopia, for example, they're not free in the Freedom Index of Freedom House.
That's correct. In the case of Ethiopia, of course, we know that there's very little space for opposition political parties. There's very little space for the independent press. There's very little space for civil society. Of course, that's due to many reasons. Fundamentally, the government that's in power there does not want to see any serious challengers. I think all over the world, of course, the rulers, like to stay in power. Sometimes they have to, deal with the sort of democratic rules of the game and go into elections and sort of prove themselves to the public that they should stay in. If the public doesn't like what they're doing, then they can get kicked out in a peaceful process. But in many countries, the rulers do not really want to follow the democratic rules, and they want to hold on to power at all costs sometimes, and so it makes it very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the paradox in Ethiopia is that these people who are in power right now, they were 17 years in the jungle as guerrilla fighters, because they thought and they found themselves that there was no political space in Ethiopia because of the military regime. But once they came to power, they forgot that or overridden that, and now they're thinking that people and other opposition don't need to have space. Obviously, they are pushing people out of options, and they may resort to armed struggle and other alternative ways to change regime.
Yeah, well, I think that it's the history of Ethiopia is very
complex,
but it's interesting. I think it's important to take a close look at it. As the history of the country has been a series of non-democratic regimes, really.
Yeah.
I mean, from the time of the emperors and Haile Selassie, he was not exactly a Democrat, to say the least. Obviously, under the Derg and Mengistu, the country was very repressive, kind of socialist dictatorship. And then, when the current government came to power, I think a lot of people in the West, in the United States in particular, thought that, this is great. The new government's going to bring democracy, and I think what we've learned is that you can't always. Well, let me put it this way: in terms of the violence, the armed struggle. And I think we can look across Africa and find a similar kind of story, where at least my conviction is that it's very seldom that an armed struggle will easily lead to democracy. I think people that resort to violence to take power generally want to hang on to that power, and the only way they know is the violence. And so we have a similar problem in South Sudan, right next door, for example, where the SPLM there waged a military struggle for many, many years. They got a lot of support in the United States for that. But once they took power, really the only thing they knew was the gun. And, they failed miserably to govern in a sort of democratic or a responsible way, and so now we have the disaster that we have in South Sudan. In the case of Ethiopia, there was a lot of optimism, or there was real progress for a while. from 1991 when the government came to power. I mean, it was a one-party regime, but it was opening up little by
Relatively
little.
up to
And
2015,
up until 2005.
Yeah, after that, the government could be able to see that people really don't support or vote for them peacefully. So they changed everything. They changed the laws, changed the system. Everything went back to like military regime. But the difference now from the military regime, Ethiopians, they despise the military regime Derg because it was authoritarian. It was a very dictatorial regime. But at the same time, Ethiopians, many opposition leaders, they feel like the current government is worse because, in the Derg era, for example, unless you are running for power, you are safe. I mean, they don't pursue you. For innocent people who are not directly involved in politics. But now what you see is because of your ethnic background, you are persecuted. So what people now feeling is that if we stay in Ethiopia, we're going to be targeted. So why don't you go to the jungle and fight using arm? So which means, if you were a peaceful person, you're just, for example, pursuing your career, or maybe you are a business person, in the Derg regime, you are targeted as a whole, like there are some socialistic policies that affect everybody. But now they are favoring certain ethnic groups and targeting certain ethnic groups. This pressurizes people to find other ways to fight. That's why, otherwise, as you said, the struggle for democracy and freedom using arms going to cost the country lives, lots of resources, and also it takes time.
Yeah, well...
But the government is not giving option to people to really pursue the peaceful and non-violent way of changing regimes.
Exactly. No, I think, it's the heart of the problem in Ethiopia. With our foundation, I think we've been interested in trying to encourage dialogue, quite frankly. The government doesn't want dialogue with the opposition, it seems. Doesn't want dialogue with civil society, or, is repressing the press that would enable that dialogue. Ethiopia, it cannot remain an island forever. It's got to have some sort of relations with the international community. It's got to start to, meet the standards that we expect of a modern country. Despite the government's sort of advocacy of this developmental democracy or revolutionary democracy, whatever they want to call it, obviously it's not a real democracy. It's a system of, one-party sort of control. But for the country to really progress, it cannot continue the way it is. It's going to have to open up the economic system to start out with, and that's where I think we see some hope. That these public-private dialogues, as we call them, with the business community. Of course, currently there's not a lot of space even for private enterprise in Ethiopia, but I think we see that as a potential arena where the government is going to be forced, just by the sort of economic and international context, to allow more space. And once you get some space there, then we hope that the room for the political opposition and civil society will also begin to come along. To some extent, I remember some years ago hearing Meles Zenawi talk about how Ethiopia was really looking towards places like Sweden or Japan, maybe South Korea as examples, where they've kind of gone from one-party dominant systems to having a real opposition. I don't know that he was sincere about that, but the fact of the matter is, in fact, I even heard Haile Mariam say something very similar. And so the government likes to talk about democracy, and so I think we in the international community especially need to really push them on that. Okay, what do you mean by democracy? How can you prove it? Unfortunately, these recent elections are not a very good sign, but I think by encouraging a sort of dialogue that little by little the government may have to realize. It reminds me, back in the 80s, there was something called the Helsinki Watch, or the Charter 77, for example, where the Soviet Union at the time sort of signed on to these documents, saying that they were going to respect human rights and certain other things. It's all in the UN, charter as well.
Yeah.
These kinds of
kind of
international
lip
documents.
Service, yeah.
Exactly.
In Ethiopia, the case is they always talk about they are democratic and they work towards more open democracy, but it's a kind of lip service. Otherwise, they are not genuine.
Yeah.
The challenge for them to be a developmental state is that those developmental states, the Asian tigers and so on, they achieved that because they had national vision. The people were united, even if the government was dictatorial, because you feel like you are part of that country, you are a citizen of that country, even if that government represses you. Mao Zedong, he used this cultural revolution, he used violence and so on, but still the people rallied after them because there was, a national vision. People were feeling that, they are part of the country, they are citizens. Back in Ethiopia, they are dividing, the people into ethnic lines, and people are fighting among themselves. How can you lead this kind of populace without giving them a national vision, and at the same time bringing them together to have this common goal? Now people are fighting for dominance. One ethnic group is dominating others. In that kind of circumstances, how can you tap into the potential of the people? You can't, because people are feeling second citizens. I ask many of my colleagues, they don't want to go back to Ethiopia and invest. Foreigners, foreign direct investment, it is unthinkable because there is no democracy, there is no rule of law. Yeah. How can you go there and invest your hard-earned currency? You can't. So while you are pushing out your educated people, many of us educated, we cannot go back because it's risky, there is no democracy. Many of the people who came to the United States and other European countries, they won't go back. They came here, they did their PhD, they're not going back. Why? Because the environment is not democratic. So while you are pushing your best people out of the country, dividing the remaining people there into ethnic lines, and favoring one ethnic group over the other, how can people really give their best? They can't. Yeah. So they have to change that. So the government, because they are short-sighted, they only see that, okay, if we divide the people alongside along ethnic groups, we can survive, we can stay in power. Right. And they don't mind the consequences of doing that, because at the end of the day, people, when they are saying enough is enough, this gonna stop. Whether it is violently or peacefully, it's gonna change, because people cannot stay forever frustrated. At some point, they will reach a point called turning point, yeah. And that at that turning point, nothing could stop the people from taking power. But the issue is, can this government understand that, be visionaries, far-sighted, change this ethnic-based politics, bring people together, open up the political space, invite people to have opinions, whichever opinion wins the support of Ethiopians, governs the country. Exactly. But they're not doing that, and I don't know how they can have this developmental state implemented and succeeded in Ethiopia. I don't see that.
No, I think you're right. It would be very difficult for them to achieve what they say they want in terms of this developmental state going the way they are. If you look at the cases of South Korea or Taiwan, for example, which started out as one-party states, I think it was the sort of economic reform that led to the development of a sort of middle class And what political scientists seem to think is that middle class is often a very important foundation for democracy. Of course, I think we also have seen the example of many very poor countries that have also managed to become democracies. But there does seem to be an advantage that these sort of more middle-income countries have. When there's that middle class that has some sort of freedom to start making demands, for greater freedom of speech or for more political choice. So we can try to work for that in the case of Ethiopia. I think in the current context as well, that the kind of thing that you're doing here with ESAT is also extremely important. That is the communications and the media, and trying to increase citizen knowledge and appreciation for democracy and these human rights and sort of international norms. I'm reminded again in the case of Nigeria, we just had a conference a few weeks ago commemorating World Press Freedom Day. And, this was right after the Nigerian elections, of course. And there was a Nigerian journalist there who was, quite a pioneer of the social media in Nigeria. And it was really just fascinating to hear, the impact that social media had in the case of Nigeria. Now, obviously, Nigeria is, or even was, a much more open sort of environment than Ethiopia. But still, I think where you're able to, penetrate and reach the average citizen with this kind of information, what is happening in the country, whether it's if there's corruption, the Nigerians were very effective in exposing that, the different issues, the different problems, to start creating that dialogue. At the end of the day, the Nigerian government really couldn't stop it, and so they had to, start answering for some of their policies, and fortunately, Nigeria was able to have these elections, which enabled the people to voice their opinions.
By the way, the Ethiopian government, they argue with that we don't want to really implement democracy as it is in the Western world. So when they are pushed to open and create democracy in the country, they say we have democracy which is fit to Africans. So let's talk about some successful African democracies from which the Ethiopian government could learn some lessons. So do you have some countries in Africa that succeeded in opening democracy so that at least the government in Ethiopia may be open to listen some lessons from this country?
Sure. Well, there are many. I mean, South Africa, of course, is a great example of a multi-ethnic country that had some very difficult negotiations over many years, but against all odds, they managed to write a new constitution, to hold free and fair elections, and to have a government that is currently quite democratic. Definitely on the Freedom House index there, it's near the top.
Is South Africa free in the
Sure.
index of
Yes.
Africa? Wow.
Yes, absolutely.
So South Africa is a good example because it's diverse. Maybe Ethiopia is a little bit more diverse, up to more than 72 ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And one of the reasons the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi was using is that if we give up power, Ethiopia disintegrates. He always uses that image, frightening the Western donors that if I lose power, if my party is out of the equation, Ethiopia as a country cannot succeed, cannot sustain as one country. But it's possible to bring diverse people together and still open the democratic space.
Exactly.
Like in South Africa.
Yeah. Well, and
So is his reason really
no,
justifiable?
I think what the government is doing, obviously, as you're suggesting, is sort of bottling up all the frustrations. So keeping the lid on things, but underneath, people are frustrated.
Yeah.
As you say, if there's simply one ethnic group, relatively small one, that is trying to maintain total control over the system, then there are going to be a lot of people that feel left out. And, the government might be doing its best. It might think that it's, providing lots of services and development and being even-handed, but if the perception is that it's still only a small group of people that's really the main beneficiaries, then you can expect that there's going to be a lot of dissension. And I think the example of South Africa shows that, for the best way to diffuse those frustrations is to have that sort of dialogue. I think the government needs to start talking seriously to its opposition. It needs to, be serious in opening up to other ethnic groups. I think the opposition also needs to, kind of step up, and of course there needs to be more unity within the opposition. All of the different antagonisms, but obviously the Amhara and the Oromo and what have you.
It's a disservice to democracy, especially to group yourself along ethnic lines, because that really favors the government. Because
exactly.
You are divided. If your house is divided, especially alongside ethnic lines,
right,
it can't stand.
Right, you're not going to get anywhere. So, I would say that there really needs to be a serious effort at a dialogue between the government and the opposition, between the various ethnic groups, the different religious groups, the different social groups, and that it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, it takes time. Obviously.
It takes a lot of time, and yet I think the advantage over an armed struggle is pretty obvious. For one, you avoid the destruction. You avoid the cost in human lives, and quite frankly, even if a armed opposition was to be victorious, there's no guarantee that they're going to be any better than the current one, the current government. Generally, as I was saying before, my experience has been that where people seize power by arms, they're not inclined to give it up.
By the way, in Ethiopia, among Ethiopians, this is a debate between opposition groups, whether they should use arm or they should just focus only on non-violent methods. And some of them we use both armed and non-violent ways. We need to mix it up because the government is closing all doors. So it's debatable. But what some people are suggesting out of, the opposition groups, some elites, Ethiopian elites, they are suggesting that the way the government is running right now, closing like winning 99.6% 2010, now maybe 100%.
Yeah.
So this really is pushing the country for maybe a military coup or something like that, because you can't really see any light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. Now it's they're closing the space, and maybe forcing to military coup or forcing the populace to go out and join armed groups, and the country may turn into civil war. So it's a debate now. It's very, very sensitive. It's very important that this issue is resolved as much as possible through dialogue, as you said. But the government, which is a key player in this equation, is not open for discussion, because they say, hey, we don't have any issue. Ethiopians are electing us 99.6%. They support us. Of course, this is fake. I mean, I don't think that even, those Tigrayans, because they claim that we are from Tigray and we sacrificed ourselves and Tigrayans support us. It's not true. Many Tigrayans, they resent them. They are even brutalized more than other ethnic groups if they show any decency against the policies of the government. So this government, they have only supporters who benefit something out of the system. Yeah. these are elite leaders who are benefiting from the system, or people from different ethnic groups who are benefiting financially, career-wise, business-wise, that are supporting. But that's not a good way of moving forward for a government without having a support from its people. Yeah. But they are claiming outside, saying that, hey, the people are electing us, we don't have any issue with our people, we don't need to create any reconciliation, or we don't need to discuss, let's move on. So it's really ridiculous. But let's talk about, as an outsider, what kind of things are missing from, for example, from the diaspora advocacy efforts? Do you see some missing links so that the diaspora may regroup itself and push efforts for democracy and freedom in Ethiopia?
Yeah. Well, I think from my limited experience, what I've seen in terms of the sort of diaspora here, the Ethiopian diaspora, is that there is and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's good to have debate, but there's definitely a lot of debate and a certain amount of, well, obviously there's disunity. We've had a series of Ethiopian fellows at the endowment, people like Peterson Medeksa, and I remember that she in particular had a lot of difficulty because she was, kind of advocating this, effort of dialogue, I suppose you might say. But others within the Ethiopian community were really attacking her, for that. And so it seems that if you're trying to take a middle position, that it's very difficult. And so that's unfortunate. I think that ideally that there would be more dialogue, more pragmatism, and it's something that we've seen not only in the case of Ethiopia, but with many sort of diaspora groups, that they tend to take extreme positions. They become very frustrated. They've been forced to leave their country, and in exile, it's much easier, maybe, to take these very hard lines. It's easier to, think maybe that you're being principled, demanding, certain very absolute sort of, goals, but very often, at the endowment, we're supporting what little we can within Ethiopia. It's very difficult for our foundation to support the kinds of programs in Ethiopia that we support around the world. In other parts of Africa, it's quite easy. In the case of Ethiopia, it's much more difficult. But still, the fact of the matter is that there are partners there that we've been able to support. And, I think they tend to be more pragmatic. They know that there are some limits, unfortunately, but working within those limits, they're still able to do quite a bit sometimes. And it gives me a certain optimism for the future. It's not going to happen overnight. And I remember before 2005, it was the same thing. In 1991, there was, still relatively little political space. By the time we got to 2005, there was really a fairly democratic sort of atmosphere, and it was very exciting at the time. It's very unfortunate.
I was in Ethiopia. I saw it just 1 month before the election. I came to the United States. Before that, I have seen the progress. I was also part of a political party leadership, so I was contributing what I could. So it was, as you said, very promising, and we hoped that the government may share some seats with oppositions, and that could lead to some form of united front for Ethiopians. But things changed, and they become more aggressive, more the leadership has become more corrupt, more brutal, and so on. Things changed. So now it looks like, of course, the question I ask always is this a sign of strength or a sign of weakness? Because a sign of strength would have been like opening spaces, tolerating dissent, And you don't need to go really after each individual who criticizes you, like journalists. Why you do that if you have the strength? But I think it's a sign of weakness, and I'm assuming that maybe the leadership doesn't have any more cards to play, so they just use gun. As you say, they were in jungle, the majority of the influential leaders, so they are back to what they know the best, which is gun. It's
no, I would totally agree with you. I don't know how enlightened the current leadership is. Maybe they need some education or some encouragement, some pushing. It's interesting in terms of that whole sort of experience of armed struggle that the current president, Haile Mariam, was not part of the armed struggle.
In the process. But he doesn't have any power right now. I mean, he's a puppet, obviously, because we know how the government works. Yeah. There are, government within the government, which means there are key people, not maybe more than 4 or 5 people. They are the one on the driver's seat. Yeah. So obviously he's just a puppet outside, making some official inaugurations, maybe speaking whatever they draft for him, the script and so on. We know how they work. So in the past they had presidents, for example. The presidents, they were just nominal. They are for ceremony. The same way some of the leaders from other ethnic groups are just there because it gives the TPLF, which is the controlling and the dominant party, a multifaceted face or a kind of diverse face. People could see, Amhara, Oromo, other people from Somalia, southern people. They see people and people may assume that this is a diverse leadership, but it is not. It's a dictatorial. A few elites are the one leading behind. So I don't think that Haile Mariam has any strong and meaningful say in the process of democratizing the country. And I don't think that he's going to be the next prime minister. I'm just feeling. I don't know.
Really? Oh, that would be interesting.
Yeah, because I think there are some leaks that there is fight for power. So the TPLF leadership, they feel like they were pushed aside, even if they are in charge in the military, security forces, and so on. They are not in charge in terms of image-wise. The prime minister is from another ethnic group, and there is fight among themselves. Yeah. So we're not sure who's going to be the next prime minister of Ethiopia. Maybe one of the TPLF leaders. We don't know.
Well, that would be very important to watch. Well,
but I have more questions on how. Let's go to the solutions.
Yeah.
What the diaspora should do, for example, to support freedom and democracy in Ethiopia, because you support democracy. What kind of things, if we, the diaspora, do that may help you support the struggle against, dictatorship and injustice and so on?
Yeah. Well, as I was saying, the kind of thing that ESAT is doing, I think, supporting ESAT and other sort of vehicles to get information inside of Ethiopia, to try to push that dialogue. The government may not particularly like it, but I think where the diaspora can, try to break through that barrier of information, that would be important. I think the kinds of agitation that I know the diaspora is doing, all the time. It's important not to give up. I agree with you that I think the current elections are probably more a sign of weakness than of strength. That one shouldn't be intimidated by this apparent consolidation of power, because I don't think it's real. I think you're right. I think that there just has to be continued pressure. I must say that in some respects I feel that the advocates of violence, of armed struggle, are really playing into the government's hands. One of the things, as you well know, that the government likes to say is, oh, well, these are all terrorists. they are somehow anti-democratic, or that they're trying to destabilize the Horn. And for the international community, some people are, for better or worse, receptive to that. So if there's this fight against terrorism, Ethiopia is, this sort of island of pro-American, in this sort of sea of Islamic terrorism.
But political analysts may have a different opinion about that, because think about it. Now, this is a minority regime where a few elites are leaders, the rest of the people are resentful, and obviously when you are resentful, you don't support the government. Whenever you can, and as much as you can, you sabotage development, you sabotage peace, and so on, because you are frustrated. You couldn't be able to do it in public. Maybe you're going to be killed, jailed, and so on. So whatever way you find, you sabotage whatever they do. So for long term, the international community, especially the donor organizations, should really find a way to rally the people against terrorism. And to do that, because now when the United States, believe me, myself and many immigrants in America, we feel like we are fortunate, we are here, we are beneficiary, and we appreciate and we are grateful to the United States. Many people flooding from around the world to come to the United States because of her values. So now when you see that top diplomats, top leaders, and the government tarnishing, those values and side with a government, a minority government that do not, that doesn't support or embrace these values, you feel like, wow. So for me, the people in Ethiopia, they resent the U.S. administration because they sided with the minority, and this government may not be there forever. We have seen in history, it looks like they are strong, but for me, they are not strong. Yeah. Because whatever they show is a reflection of their weaknesses, and at the end of the day, they may not be there to help the United States and other European countries to promote peace and stability in the Horn of Africa. Yeah. The best way could have been, democratic organizations like yourself going there, helping people, empowering leaders to come to the terms that terrorism is not beneficiary to anyone, so that you have supporters and partners at the grassroots level. But that's not happening because the government closed every door so that external non-profit organizations won't be able to operate in Ethiopia. Local non-profit, they couldn't be able to operate. So if they're not able to operate, that means they cannot empower the people. If the people are not educated, empowered about fundamentalism, fundamentalism about religious fundamentalism, terrorism, and so on, you have only guns. And you know that the more you force people using gun, the more you induce more violence. Right. Propping, because people start to resent and they start to join the terrorists. Yeah. So you can't really solve. Of course, you have to contain terror for a while using force, but you can't solve it forever. The best way is to empower leaders at local level, whether it is in Ethiopia, or whether it's in Muslim communities, raising people who oppose it. So you can't always fight using proxy. For a while, yes. In short term, yes. But in long term, the best way is to go there, raise leaders at local level, people who know the situation down there. And you have a sustainable and long-term partnership with the people. But you supporting a government, a minority elite government, for short season, you may be able to contend it, but you can't fix the problem with this kind of government, which is busy trying to, extinguish fire, from every corner.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree with you. I think unfortunately there are many people in the U.S. government that seem to have been deceived by this, sort of rhetoric about terrorism. From the Ethiopian government, and I'm intrigued by the idea that you've raised there. There was a similar thing that happened in South Africa, where there were programs that were educating young South Africans, about democracy. They, would come to the U.S. and do these sort of education programs, but was exposing them to the sort of democratic system that we have in the United States. It strikes me that a similar sort of thing could happen in the case of Ethiopia. I mean, obviously there's a huge diaspora here in the United States that have a very deep understanding of democracy. You've been living it, and
I've seen it practically.
You know what democracy is really, and so for the Ethiopian government to somehow suggest that they're following a different path to democracy or different kind of democracy, I think is really
it's win-win
foolish.
For
it's
Ethiopia,
deceptive.
for the leadership.
Ethiopians know what a real democracy is. You here know what a real democracy is, and to be able to convey that to your compatriots back in Ethiopia, I think would be very, very helpful. I mean, we were talking about things that the diaspora could do, and it seems to me that working with maybe looking for resources from the U.S. Obviously, there's resources within the Ethiopian diaspora here, but to kind of augment that, and try to establish a sort of program of exchange, with the Ethiopian diaspora. What real democracy is all about. Let's try to spread that more in the case of, and I think most Ethiopians really, like I was saying before 2005, we were working with a lot of people that had a very good understanding of, democracy. We don't call it Western democracy. We call it, just
democracy. I mean, it's
plain
universal.
old democracy.
There may be difference in terms of, for example, implementation. The way you structure regions
parliamentary
and so on.
democracy, or
but
federalism,
democracy
whatever.
is all about you opening for diverse views.
That's right.
And not intimidating people, persecuting and killing and jailing people when they differ with you. That's just democracy. We don't need to complicate it. Now, the government in Ethiopia is saying there is democracy is just ridiculous. And do you have some programs, or do you intend in the future to support this effort toward this democratizing Ethiopia?
Oh, sure. Like I said, I mean, one of the programs that we're doing is this public-private dialogue. Trying to get the business community in Ethiopia to enable them to have these conversations with, the Ethiopian government to talk about economic reform, to talk about opening up the economic system, and I think we'll be continuing that because it's making very small progress, we feel. But there are other things as well, in terms of promoting more media. I mean, we're supporting some Ethiopian media. It's difficult. We're supporting some modest civic education programs. There are a handful of NGOs that have a certain kind of waiver from the Ethiopian government to do programs. It's very limited. The space is small compared to the kind of work that we can do in, almost every other African country. There's much less in Ethiopia, but still there's a little bit. And so, whatever little space there is that we can try to strengthen, we're definitely doing that. Ethiopia is a priority for us at the endowment. We've had these series of Ethiopian fellows, that have been able to talk, very openly, and we want to continue dialogue even as an institution with the Ethiopian government. I just saw an article yesterday that was sort of vilifying the endowment, as being, the vehicle of these color revolutions and, trying to hoist this neoliberal ideology on Ethiopia. It's silly.
They're trying to make you defensive,
that's right.
You don't push them for basic rights like democracy and justice and so on. And so I mean, that sort of thing happens from time to time. We're sort of used to it, but what we want to do is to have a real engagement with people in the Ethiopian government. There might be some, maybe there aren't so many, but we're not out to overthrow any sort of regime.
we're not interested in, certainly not interested in violence. Our the laws that govern the endowment are very clear on that issue. We're not going to support violence of any kind. We're not interested in destabilizing the situation. And, I can recognize, even though I know many people in the opposition or in the diaspora may not be so sympathetic, but, I've traveled to Ethiopia many times, and, I think in terms of the economy that there has been some progress. I give the government, some credit for some of the economic progress that's been made. It may not be as even as it should be. There may be, plenty of corruption. There may be a lot of problems with it. It may not be sustainable. But, I think compared to some other countries that we work in, Ethiopia has made some progress on that score. And, I don't think we want to deny that in any way.
I think, in the diaspora, many people, they recognize that there is some kind of economic movement. The argument is that what is the measure to say that this economy is flamboyant and progressing and achieving some success? For example, in Ethiopia, the inflation rate is high, unemployment rate is high, skyrocketed. Not only that, people are running away from that economy. So the question is, can we say that if you have many roads, many buildings, that the country is economically advancing? No. The measure should have been on the lives of the people. Now, if people are running away, even risking to be killed by ISIS in Syria and so on, what's going on actually on the ground? As you said, of course, that economy, the blooming part of the economy in Addis Ababa, is controlled by some people who are favored by the ruling party, and there are so many corruptions. At the same time, who's benefiting? Those few people who are supporters and sympathizers of the ruling party. The majority of Ethiopians are excluded from the development, whatever development is there. But development should have been measured in terms of, for example, stabilizing some economic indicators like inflation, unemployment rate, and so on. But what we see is people are risking their lives, running away from the country. Many people, many business people, leaving their business, purchasing, kind of visa, coming to the United States or somewhere else, starting from scratch. If the economy was really actually progressing and if it was sustainable, people wouldn't have risked their business and leave the country. Yeah. So we admit that there are some movements in terms of expanding the road system, building some buildings, and opening some businesses and so on. But actually, when you see in the lives of the people in Ethiopia, that's not a reflection of economic development. Otherwise, we acknowledge that.
And I would have to say, too, that, whatever economic development there has been, it's great if there has been economic development, but that does not make up for the fact that there's not freedom, maybe there's an expression I always used to like, it's that, those people that say we have to have bread before freedom will probably not get either. Yeah. And so that, there may be some economic progress right now, but as long as Ethiopia is not free,
there's no sustainable development,
then it's not going to be sustainable. Yeah. Who want, or as Sekou Touré, although I don't agree with everything Sekou Touré, stood for, but, he did make a very good comment once that, it's better to be free and poor than, rich and in chains.
Exactly. I agree with that. Yeah, I think every Ethiopian, culturally, Ethiopians are, they have self-image, self-respect. So people, I think they prefer to be free and poor than to be rich and then bound by a dictatorial regime. But they are hopeless. I mean, it's about life and death. So people prefer to live regardless of the worsening situation in Ethiopia. Do you have any last word to the international community and donor organizations about advancing democracy and freedom in Africa and in Ethiopia?
Yeah, well, I think we just have to recognize that this is a long-term project. I think there's been a lot of progress in Africa. Ethiopia, there's always going to be ups and downs. But I would say don't give up. Keep at it. Certainly at the endowment, and I think within the U.S. in general, that there's a lot of support for what you're trying to do to establish a real democracy. And it's going to be difficult. There's a lot of things that we don't know, but I'm convinced that someday you'll get there.
Thank you very much. I know you are very busy, but you came here and we had this wonderful discussion, so I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on behalf of ISAT and our viewers.
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Dave. Dear our viewers, this is my hope that you enjoyed our discussion. If you are a politician in Ethiopia or in the diaspora, if you are from the government side or if you are in the opposition side, always try your best to bring democracy and freedom in Ethiopia, because there is no development that can sustain without democracy, freedom, and justice. And this is a responsibility of every Ethiopian. Do your best in terms of bringing democracy, justice, and freedom to Ethiopia. Thank you very much for watching.